Hi, my name is Marie Romagnano, founder of Healthcare Professionals for Divine Mercy. I'm happy to present to you our educational conferences that integrate medicine, bioethics, and the spirituality of Divine Mercy in patient care for healthcare professionals. Because of their importance, even if you're not a medical professional, we invite you to join us. Today, I would like to present a summary of the talk given by Father Joe Roesch, Vicar General of the Marian Fathers of the Immaculate Conception, entitled Spiritual Development of the Healthcare Professional for Personal Growth and the Benefit of the Patient. Father Roesch's talk seeks to help medical professionals to reflect on some of their clinical experiences in order to discover what was behind some of their decisions in working with patients and other professionals. It aims to assist medical professionals to discover how they are affected by their daily experiences of sickness, suffering, death, and so forth, and to evaluate their coping mechanisms. It also offers them some tools to assist them in their spiritual development for their personal growth and the benefit of their patients. By sharing some personal stories of his experience in hospitals as a seminarian while taking clinical pastoral education, Father Joe draws on some lessons from these experiences that all can relate to. He speaks about working with young residents and interns during the summer, getting to know patients in different settings, maintaining a professional distance from patients in trauma units, and the consequences of some protective mechanisms. Loving and making oneself vulnerable when appropriate, respecting patients and staff as persons worthy of respect, dealing with tiredness and busyness, coping with the strong emotions that come from dealing with sickness and death daily. Father Joe reflects on some scriptural passages and concludes by offering some suggestions for spiritual development, such as daily or frequent Mass for strength when possible, regular confession, finding time for spiritual reading, such as the Diary of St. Faustina, talking to others, such as a chaplain or spiritual support person, and forming a cenacle group, or something of this nature. I now invite you to listen to the complete presentation by Father Joe Roesch as he speaks on spiritual development of the healthcare professional for personal growth and the benefit of the patient. Thank you.
It's not easy speaking right after lunch. And hopefully you all had a good cup of coffee for lunch. And before I went into the seminary, I worked as an actor for a while. And so God blessed me with a very deep voice. And somebody who I used to go to college with used to ask me to read these stories on tape so she could, listen to them and fall asleep to this voice. So hopefully I'm not going to have that effect on you today. But it is a great blessing to be here with you. Just a little bit about myself. I grew up in Staten Island, New York. And as I said, after college, I did work as an actor for a while. Then when I joined the Marians, I worked in formation studies. I was working with the men who were seminarians and novices and postulants. And then when I made my first vows, that was 25 years ago this summer, as a matter of fact, I was ordained in 1992. And I've been, as Marie said, living in Rome for the last 8 years. It was a great privilege and a joy to be present in St. Peter's Square when Pope Francis was elected, and to see there, pray with him and pray over him and pray for him and for his pontificate. And so it was quite an electric atmosphere to be there that particular day. My work there, I was there elected for 6 years. I didn't speak a word of Italian when I went, so it was quite a shock. Even panic attacks. But eventually I learned the language, had an interesting experience over there. As a matter of fact, when I first went over there, I got kidney stones, and I was in the hospital for a couple of days with that. And so that helped me to learn Italian, just to communicate with the doctors and the nurses. And the doctor had actually, he was from Italy. He had studied in the States, which made me feel good. And then he went back to work in Italy, and they put in a stent to have the exit strategy for the pulverized stones. And then he said to me, I just came in for a little outpatient thing to take that out. And while he was working on me down there, he took 2 cell phone calls during that time. He took the first call. He says, I can't believe people call me at a time like this. Isn't this terrible? I'm not going to take any more calls. And then the phone rang again, and of course he had to answer it and gesticulate and use the gestures. And I was saying, I hope he'll be concentrating on what he's doing down here. You know? But we finally got through it, and that was an interesting experience. Okay. Now, during my own seminary training, I had some interesting experiences. I had some practical pastoral experience that I gained through working in some hospitals in the Washington, D.C. area. So during one academic year, I spent several hours a week as a student chaplain in training at the Washington Hospital Center, and the floor that I had was called 3E. It was for shock, trauma, and burn patients. And so we often ended up visiting people who had been shot or stabbed or burned, sometimes by people that they knew, members of their own family. And there were sometimes armed guards in the hallways in front of some of the patients' rooms to make sure that some of the visitors didn't come to finish off the job that they had started in the streets. And the unit was even famous on the streets of Washington because some young gang members would threaten others by saying, I'm going to send you to 3E. And they knew the unit in the hospital that they were talking about. Now, some priests are afraid to visit hospitals because they don't know what they're going to run into. And unfortunately, over the years, depending on when you studied in the seminary, some didn't receive very good pastoral training. Some of the training that they received in the seminary was entirely theoretical. So the practical was something that you just had to learn on your own, and some of them just continue to have that fear. I found that after I had this training, which was very good, I was ready to face just about anything. But when I arrived at the hospital during those summers, I found there was a kind of a resistance in myself. I would find myself walking down the hallway, and it was a very long hallway from the parking lot to the rooms where I was going to have to be meeting these patients. And I would be passing offices, and I would see people working at the computers in their offices, and it would look very inviting to me. And I'd say to myself, why can't I just go into one of these little offices with these just anonymous little places? Why do I have to go to these rooms and visit these people and talk to them about their suffering and what their problems are? But a lot of times the anticipation is worse than the experience itself. And so I would talk my way through the hallway, and by the time I got to the room and I started talking one-on-one with a person, the Lord would give me an opening. We very much would find something to talk about, something to pray about, and very often very good things would happen in the interaction. But you have to get over that anticipation and the fear and all the blocks that come up in your heart and in your spirit, and it's worth it because the Lord can use you in different ways. Now, after that academic year, I spent a summer taking CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education, that summer, and I spent about 40 hours a week for 10 weeks in Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C., and also some time right next door at the Washington Hospital Center as well. And we would visit patients, we would write up verbatims, we would be critiqued by supervisors and peer groups. We would have some didactic classes, and also we had to take turns spending the night in the hospital as the on-call chaplain. And we would usually get beeped to minister to family members of the patients who arrived by helicopter at the MedStar unit. So they were the trauma patients. And we also got sometimes called to the intensive care units to be with patients or staff if there was a code blue or if someone had died. So there were a variety of things that we were called for. Now, my floors in the Children's Hospital had children with spina bifida, with broken bones, and I occasionally worked with some families of cancer patients. And it was an interesting dynamic for me because when I was working at the hospital center, we had interactions with usually one patient, and you would deal with that one person and talk about what they were going through and what they were suffering. It was a completely different dynamic in the Children's Hospital because very often the children weren't aware of how grave their sickness or their illness was. And so you would talk to them on one level, but then you would talk to the whole family unit, sometimes the parents, the grandparents, the aunts, the uncles, the brothers, the sisters, and sometimes you were dealing with a whole group of people at the same time. So it became a very different type of pastoral ministry for me, but a very rich and enriching experience as well to understand how this sickness in the family is affecting the whole family right across the family unit. I did my first baptism that summer. It was a little child who had to go in for an operation who had cancer. Um, I ended up, because it was an emergency situation, baptizing this child. And then the mother and father were not married, right afterwards asked me if I could baptize him as well. I advised him to go to his pastor. And then I recounted the story to two young boys who had broken legs. They had the legs elevated in traction. One had, I think both of them had ended up running out in front of traffic and gotten hit by cars. So I was telling them the story. And one of them, with his mother there, asked me if I could baptize him as well. So I really started to feel like John the Baptist at that moment, as they were just coming to me for baptism. But again, I advised them to go to their particular church as well. So I'd like to share a couple of stories with you about a couple of experiences I had in that hospital that summer, which have stuck with me, and maybe they can help you and myself to reflect on my goals for this talk, which are to help you to reflect on some of your clinical experiences in order to discover what was behind some of your decisions in working with patients and other professionals. Two, to assist you to discover how you are affected by your daily experiences of sickness, suffering, death, etc., and to evaluate your coping mechanisms. And three, to offer you some tools to assist you in your spiritual development for your personal growth and for the benefit of your patients. So the first story, there was one night when I was on call at the Washington Hospital Center, and since I spent 10 weeks there during the summer, I'm sure that I ran into the so-called July effect. I don't have to explain to you what that means. Medical students have just graduated in June who are beginning their first year of residency training or internship in July. Well, one night, I was beeped to come to the MedStar unit, and a young doctor met me in the hall, and he said to me very brusquely, "Are you the chaplain?" And I said, "Yes." And he says, "Good, come with me." And we went into the MedStar waiting room, and there was a African-American woman there, a young woman, and he said, hello. He introduced himself. He said, your brother, I'm sorry, was flown in here. I'm sorry, but he was killed by gunshot wounds. We did everything that we could, but that's all that we could do right now. This is the chaplain. He'll take it from here. Now, I was hearing this for the first time as well, as he was saying this, and my eyes were getting wider. So there was a stunned silence for a moment as he was leaving, and it sunk in, and then she just burst into tears and fell into my arms and just sobbed for the longest time. There's nothing I could really do to help her besides just be present to her and to be with her, to try to comfort her as best I could. Eventually, we prayed together. Eventually, after many hours, she left. But I was left with that experience because I had been sleeping, actually, and it was the middle of the night. I got beeped. I came down there. I'm just trying to wake up. Without any introduction, he's dragging me into this room, and I was stunned to learn this at that moment. So the questions that came up into my mind afterwards was, why did he do that to me? Why didn't he say something in the hallway to prepare me? Maybe he was as tired and busy as I was, but maybe he didn't know what to say to prepare me for what we were going to encounter in there, but he had more of a clue than I did. And maybe he was afraid I would balk and not want to go into the waiting room with him, and he would have to deal with it himself. So, but as I reflected on it more, I realized that people are not objects. We're not chess pieces to be moved into position. He, no doubt, had a learning curve, just as I did. But as you reflect on your own experiences, you might think of some things that you might have done differently if you could do them over again. And hopefully he, if he could go back to that, would have done things differently. Now, as you know, the nature of a MedStar unit is that you're dealing with traumatic cases, one after another. You're often sending the patients to be operated on elsewhere or sent off to rooms, so there's little time to get to know the patients or the families. And often there's no time for either. But to protect oneself, sometimes it's easier to distance oneself from the humanity of the patient, to refer to them by their trauma or their bed position. But these protection mechanisms can be so strong that one can eventually become hardened, cynical, even empty inside. And to love means to make oneself vulnerable. Now, obviously, given the constraints of working in such a unit, not everything is possible. However, there are some things that you can do. For instance, the human thing to do for that young doctor would have been to introduce himself to me, to explain the situation before entering the room, and perhaps giving me a second to collect my thoughts. Um, because each person that we encounter in the hospital, no matter who they are, gives us an opportunity to show love through our patience, through our smile, through our acknowledgement of their humanity, of their dignity. And there are things that we can do which don't take very long. It comes down to examining our attitudes, our presuppositions, and our behaviors as we interact with people. Another story. In the middle of the night, I was beeped to go to an intensive care unit because of a code blue. And I had already been beeped many times that night. I didn't have very much sleep, so I was very, very tired. Someone was dying. Many young residents were streaming into the intensive care unit to help. In this particular unit, there was a second patient in the same area, and I was asked to stay with that patient while all this ruckus was going on because it might be very upsetting for her. So I stayed with her, I talked with her, I prayed with her, and of course I observed what was going on. So I listened to these young interns trying to figure out what to do. There was a lot of looking things up and consulting and discussing and arguing with one another. And as it turned out, eventually the patient died. Now, I was also asked eventually to pray with the family members of the person who died when they arrived, and I did that. And so when they arrived, the young intern was talking to the family members, and he assured the family that the top specialists from the area had been there to assist them, and they had done everything possible. Now, this didn't seem to correspond with the scene that I had just witnessed, but I didn't say anything, and I did pray with the family, and eventually they found some closure and they left. And then I sat down in a chair outside of the unit, feeling completely exhausted at that point, and an intensive care nurse arrived who had just come on duty, and she was ready to start working with that particular patient who had just died. And when she had gotten off duty the day before, the patient had actually been doing better, and there seemed to be an upswing. So she was expecting to come into work and have a very hopeful situation. And unfortunately, she came into the patient and she was to work, and she was completely shocked to find out the patient had just died. So she sat down opposite me and she began to cry and talk about this and how it had affected her. And I have to say, this shocked me because I was so used to the MedStar nurses who were so distant from the patients, kind of shutting down feelings and emotions and appearing so cynical. And I was amazed at how much this intensive care nurse was affected by the death of this patient. And it was completely different for me. So again, this was a learning experience for me. And of course, the difference has to do, as you know, with how much time one spends with someone. So as you get to know a patient and the family, and we see the progress or the lack thereof, we are drawn into the lives of the people that we're helping, and we are affected by their successes or their failures. So I prayed with that nurse that night, and I learned that nurses and doctors are human too. And my faith in the humanity of these doctors and nurses was restored that night. So as I reflected on that experience, I thought about how strongly you in your work can be affected by your experiences. You are dealing with life and death, sickness and suffering on a daily basis, and this is not easy. You regularly experience strong emotions, or you come into contact with people who are expressing strong emotions because people's lives are at stake. We are humans. We are not machines. And I learned that even when we, to protect ourselves, close down some of the emotions to try to help us to handle the brutality of one traumatic case after another, we're still affected by all these experiences that happen to us, all that we see and experience. It gets in there somewhere, and we file it away somewhere, but it's in there. And so we can push things away and not acknowledge the immensity of what we're dealing with on a regular basis, but we're still very strongly affected. So the question is, how do you do it? What do you do? How do you cope with all that you carry with you? Well, in the end, we're human, and we all have to bring these things to God. He is the creator of all life. We can sometimes begin to doubt his goodness and his mercy because we can ask ourselves, how can he allow good people to suffer so much? How can he allow such bad things to happen to good people? I can't get too deeply into the whole mystery of suffering because that would be another whole talk. But we as Catholic Christians, we can find answers in the cross of Christ. When we look at how much he suffered for love of us, and we know that God is not a cruel God. He doesn't want any of us to suffer. His original plan was that his creation could live in harmony with him in an earthly paradise forever. That's what we read in the first book of the scriptures. However, we know that our first parents rejected this plan and rejected God through original sin. They decided that God, through their choice, they were deciding, in effect, that God wasn't necessary, that they could do it all themselves. And we've been trying to ratify this ever since by our choices and our sinful choices. Sometimes we can run into people in the hospital who think they are God. But we can't do anything without the help of God. And as a result of that original sin, suffering and sickness and death came into the world. And then Jesus came to try to set things right, to reverse what our first parents did and put us back into a right relationship with our Heavenly Father once again. And the miracles that he performed, especially the healings, are a sign for us of the good things yet to come, of a heaven where there will be no more tears or suffering or sickness or disease or sadness. And we believe in the reality that God is love and that he is very, very merciful. He suffers alongside all who are suffering. And through our faith, we can try to bring some peace and some hope into the lives of all of our patients who are struggling and suffering and doubting. Our presence can make a difference. And so if we have a strong faith, this can help tremendously because it can help us to understand what's going on in these situations. I remember my supervisor that summer talked to me about an experience he had had when he was a young intern chaplain. There was a Jewish man who had lost his wife, and he was in the hospital, and he was so upset with God. How could God let this happen? And he was just railing against God, and he says, I cannot believe in a God who could do something like this, who could allow something like this to happen. Well, the young student chaplain was at a loss for words. He didn't know what to do or what to say, so he just sat on the bed and listened to the man and tried to be present to him. And the man went on and on and on. And finally, after a while, he thanked the young chaplain for listening to him. And now he says, would you please excuse me? I now have to say the Kaddish, the Jewish prayers for the dead. So it's interesting that a man who no longer believed in God would want to pray those prayers. But I think it's a sign for us that sometimes, obviously, the head and the heart have to be connected. We can react so strongly on an emotion level that we can just want to logically conclude that God could not exist. But at the same time, the traditions that we have can help us through, the rituals that we have can help us through those kind of situations where we don't know how to go forward. And some of the familiar prayers and some of the familiar rituals can help us to find the path again and find the way to go forward. So maybe he didn't believe in God at that moment, but he also was going to find comfort in saying those familiar prayers, even if they maybe were going up toward a black hole that he wasn't sure if somebody was up there listening. And maybe just the recitation of the prayers might have been the formula that was needed for him to try to find his way again. And the other thing that can teach us is that God can take our doubts and our fears. And God is not going to go away, even when we rail against him. If you look in the scriptures, some of the Psalms are, oh God, how long do I have to put up with this? And God can take that. There's no problem. So when you need to get it out of your system and have it out with God, feel free to do so. There's no problem there. God is not going to go away. He's very patient, and he can take any kind of prayer. He's happy to have any kind of communication with us. Doesn't always have to be a perfect, beautiful one where we try to put our best face forward. Sometimes the very ugly prayers can be what's needed to keep that relationship going forward. It's the same thing in a family. Sometimes you have to just work out the differences, no matter how you do it. So God is present to us, whether we feel his presence or whether he seems to be absent, whether we're going through a period of desolation, of darkness, and it seems that God is completely gone. He doesn't go away. So we shouldn't be afraid to work things out with him. So now, I'd just like to give you some tools that you can use to help you to grow spiritually through some of the experiences that you're having every day at the hospital or in the office or wherever you're working with people. And we can learn a few lessons from the scriptures. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, Luke 2 times writes about Mary, the mother of Jesus, how she reflected on her experiences in her heart. After the visit of the shepherds to the manger, after the birth of Jesus, we read in Luke 2:19, and Mary kept all these things, reflecting on them in her heart. And then, after Mary and Joseph lose the child Jesus during their pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and they find him again in the temple, we read in Luke chapter 2, verse 51, he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them, and his mother kept all these things in her heart. Now, Mary didn't understand all of the things that happened to her, so she would take the time to reflect on them in the light of God's love and basically have a dialogue with God about them. Okay, what does this mean? Why did this happen? What are you trying to teach me through this? What was the purpose of this? And she would reflect on it and mule on it and contemplate it and turn it over in her mind and in her heart in dialogue with the Lord, with the Father. And maybe if we take the time to do something like that, God will take that opportunity to give us some enlightenment and say, well, maybe I wanted to teach you this here, or maybe this was the reason that happened. Sometimes we won't get all the answers because we're walking through this life. We walk by faith, not by sight. So sometimes we won't see the answer or the conclusion or the consequence or the reason that something's happened for a long, long time into the future, maybe even after we die. But maybe we can get some sense of what's going on if we do take that time to step back and reflect and pray and try to look at some of those experiences in our heart. Because we don't catch the meaning of most of the things that happen to us the first time through. And the problem is, we, and especially you and your profession, are inundated with experiences every day, one after another after another. It was interesting. My father had hip replacement surgery 6 or 7 years ago. Both went very well. He hasn't had any pain or any problems since, except recently he had a terrible infection that was right down to the bone. And the doctor was so upset that either we would have to have one operation to take it out, another one to put it back in, or do something, just stopgap, to help him to walk again. And he's 89, and he doesn't want to do something at that age. So he was very upset. My mother and father have a great deal of faith. My mother was putting all kinds of relics on the wound and praying and asking us all to pray. And then all of a sudden, the doctor said, surprisingly, there's no infection of the bone. And another doctor said, I'm very surprised and very happy. So my mother says, well, do you think God might have had anything to do with it? And he said, well, I don't think God would be so arbitrary. Why would he help you with this one? And he's not helping me with all the other 1,000 problems that I have. So he was looking at it from one perspective. My mother was looking at it from another. But I think God does want to help us. And he does. And if we have faith, he can help us to understand these things. And so you're having all these experiences that you're inundated with, and the problem is we bolt through life, we're just moving forward, we never look back, we're inundated with information, much of it useless. When we try to relax, we go on the internet and we look at which Hollywood actress was arrested this week and all this useless information. And we never take the time to get down to what really matters in life and reflect on what is God trying to teach us through our experiences. And so someone once said, an unreflected life is not worth living, and yet most of us are living very unreflected lives. We're just barreling forward without ever taking the time to look back. So in our community, Father Kaz and the Marian Fathers, we have some rules. Once a month, we take a retreat day. We try to take just a quiet day. We try to shut off all the devices and try to shut down all this tremendous stimulation that's coming at us and just try to be quiet and silent and pray. In the diary of St. Faustina, it said it's very hard for God to help someone to grow spiritually if there's no silence in their lives, because we're just inundated with noise. And I think that's part of the deception of our culture and the evil one just trying to get us to be so confused and so running this way and that. We have no time to listen to God, and God has no openings to get through to our hearts. Now, another thing that's helpful is keeping a spiritual journal. St. Faustina kept a spiritual diary at the advice of her confessor. We have another member of our community who's beatified, Blessed George Matulaitis. He would often write things down in a spiritual journal. And sometimes just the actual action of writing something down can help you to process it. As you're writing it down, it forces you to think about what happened, reflect on it, look back at it, and then as you're thinking, well, what am I going to write next? Sometimes the thoughts come to you exactly how to handle a particular situation or to reflect on it in the light of God's love. Now, another very helpful scripture story is the one of the death of Lazarus, who was a friend of Jesus in Bethany. It's in chapter 11 of the Gospel of John. It's a very rich story. Jesus is moved to tears because of the death of his friend. And Lazarus had two sisters, Mary and Martha. And Mary can't figure out why Jesus didn't come sooner and not let his friend die. Sometimes we can't figure out why God let something happen the way it did. Now, Jesus allowed this death of Lazarus in this particular instance to bring about a greater good. By raising Lazarus, many came to believe in Jesus. And we were just hearing the scriptures from Lent that the religious authorities are going to kill Lazarus as well as Jesus, because too many people are going to start believing in Jesus because he brought Lazarus back from the dead. And so Martha's conversation with Jesus is very powerful. Martha says to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." And Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise." And Martha said to him, "I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day." And Jesus told her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" And she said to him, "Yes, Lord. I have come to believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who is coming into the world." Now, this is something that we can all meditate on, but you especially, I think, in your profession, because you have to face death every day in your work. And this is not the end of the story. These patients who are suffering so much will rise again. God wants us all to live with him forever in heaven, because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. We're right in the midst of the Easter season. Jesus has just risen from the dead on Easter Sunday, and he's alive, and he's right here in our presence. He's right here with us. We can't see him, but he's right here present with us. And it's the same thing in the hospitals and in the doctor's offices. He's right there with you in your ministry and in your work. So, as you struggle to find the meaning in suffering and death, you can dialogue with Jesus as Martha and Mary did. Martha and Mary were friends of Jesus. We're friends of Jesus. So again, we can talk very directly, as they did. If you had only been here, he wouldn't have died. What happened? Where were you? What's going on? And we should do the same. I can take this, can I? I don't know whose it was. Hopefully, there's not too many germs. But we can say that. What does it mean, Lord? Why did he die? Why did she die? What are you doing to me? What's going on here? The Lord wants to dialogue with us. Okay. Another wonderful way of bringing our patients before the Lord is through attending Mass. And if you can get to Mass every day, that's a great blessing. I was working as an actor before I went into the seminary, and I was thinking about the priesthood. I ended up doing a passion play in New York City, and it was actually during Lent that I began. I said to myself, well, look, if you're really thinking about this priesthood thing, you're going to have to say Mass every day when you're a priest. So you should try to go to Mass every day, see how long you can stand it. I had to talk my way into these things. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gone along with it. And so I started going to Mass every day, and now it's the center of my life. I wouldn't have it any other way. I wouldn't want to miss Mass. And so that's a great thing to do if you can try and get into the practice of going to daily Mass, because the Lord comes into our hearts in the Eucharist to strengthen us. He speaks to us through the readings. When the readings are proclaimed at Mass, it's really Jesus speaking to us and teaching us and guiding us. And we're united to him as we receive him in Holy Communion. We receive his body and blood. So he's strengthening you. And then we are united with all those who have gone before us because we pray for the dead at every Mass. And so when you go into work, you go into the hospital, you're strengthened with a special strength and power through the Eucharist that you receive that is far beyond your own abilities and your own strength. You've got many talents, but when you're carrying the Lord with you, it's a whole different ballgame. So when we open up our hearts to the graces that the Lord has prepared for us on a daily basis, and the thing is, the Lord doesn't get too far ahead of himself. He gives us the grace we need for today. Then he'll give us the grace we need for tomorrow. That's why he wants us to keep coming back. It's like going back to the well. You got to keep drawing that water every day. Is there a water down there? Maybe Another beautiful thing is Eucharistic adoration. This is another wonderful source of power and strength. It's like receiving radiation therapy. St. Faustina says that the rays coming from the monstrance of the Blessed Sacrament. Thank you, Jim. St. Faustina said that the rays coming from the monstrance of the Blessed Sacrament were just like the rays that she saw coming from the heart of Jesus in the Divine Mercy image. And so you can visit any parish or chapel where there's a tabernacle, and Jesus is waiting there for you. And he wants to radiate you with his love and his mercy through his presence in the tabernacle. And if you can't get to a tabernacle or Catholic parish where there is the Eucharist, you could just gaze on the Divine Mercy image. And I think that's sort of like a substitute, because when we gaze upon the image, we're thinking about Jesus, we're opening our heart to him, and he's taking that opportunity of an open heart to pour out his love and his mercy on us, because he promised to pour out many graces through the image of the Divine Mercy. And he says that's why everyone should have access to it. And so get before a tabernacle to receive the radiation therapy, or gaze upon an image of Jesus in the Divine Mercy. And again, we're opening our heart to receive his graces, and then we're strengthened and we can do our work better. Another wonderful way of growing is getting to the sacrament of penance or reconciliation on a regular basis. It's a wonderful way of helping us to grow in our spiritual lives. Once a month is great if you can do it. You know that you need regular medical checkups to get rid of all the problems and the things that you're carrying, to check the blood and make sure that everything is becoming vital and healthy. So how can we be carrying around sins and weaknesses and all these other things with us? We want to get that fresh start. The Lord doesn't want us to be carrying these things with us. They become such a burden. So if we keep clearing them away, we can grow and we can develop and we can become strong. Now, to prepare ourselves for that, another wonderful practice is examining our conscience, something you can do in the evenings before you go to bed. We want to thank the Lord for the day that we've had, for the help He's given us. We want to ask the strength we need to have patience in our interactions with others. And we want to also ask for forgiveness for our failings. And it helps us to focus on where we've been and where we're going. St. Ignatius had, the founder of the Jesuits, had said this is one of the most important ways to grow in the spiritual life. You know, he would say, if you can't get some of your other prayers in, that's okay, but get this in, because this makes sure we're staying on the right path, because it's very easy to stray and go off the path. And then reading the diary of St. Faustina is another great way of learning about how God interacts with a soul to help it to grow. It doesn't read like a novel, but we can use it like a devotional. We can read a little passage each night, let's say, before we go to bed. And it's like a spiritual morsel. We can chew on it. And like a spiritual snack, you know, you can even have those little pamphlets or Marie's little book. You know, read a little passage in between when you have a little time off. And it's like a little spiritual pick-me-up. And of course, it also helps to talk to others, to share our concerns with fellow doctors and nurses, the priest or spiritual director. You might consider forming a cenacle group of the Eucharistic Apostles of Divine Mercy, something that Dr. Bryan spoke about. Because small groups meet on a regular basis to reflect on the scriptures, the diary of St. Faustina, the teachings of the Church on mercy, so that it becomes a way of life, so that we're transformed by this spirituality of mercy. Pope Francis is talking about this so much. Every day he's talking about mercy, tenderness, the look of love. It's so beautiful, this spiritual teaching that he's been giving us in these first couple of weeks of his pontificate. And when we gather in a little group, the Lord helps us to support one another. we support each other in our spiritual journeys. We support each other and help each other to carry our burdens. We share with one another. We pray for one another. We encourage one another to practice the corporal and the spiritual works of mercy. And the Lord can use these opportunities, because when two or three are gathered in his name, he's right there in the midst of them. So in conclusion, I sometimes think about how the Lord placed me in that chair outside that intensive care unit that night, completely exhausted, but he wanted me there because he knew that nurse was arriving on duty. He knew she needed someone to share with and to pray with and to help her through that crisis in her moment, crisis moment in her life, and I happened to be there at that moment. Well, the same thing can happen to each of you. The Lord places you in particular situations, in particular hallways, in particular waiting rooms. And the Lord gives you that opportunity to be his presence to these people who are hurting. And you have the faith to be able to help these people at that particular moment. And all we have to do is make ourselves available. The Lord will do the rest. The Lord takes it from there. So God can use each of us in all different types of situations to help other people. God has a plan and a purpose for each one of you. So all he asks us to do is to open our hearts, to surrender to this plan, and he will continue to use you as he has been doing. I hope this has been helpful. I will pray for all of you. God bless you.
Thank you for viewing our program. Please see our website, divinemercymatters.org, for additional educational resources. Thank you.